Hello, guys. Welcome back to my channel, Knowledge Central, where I try to shed knowledge on different aspects of things I learn from reading, from my career, and also from my past bachelor's and also completed master's a few years back. So it's mostly about different aspects and self-improvement and things like that. So yeah, if you like any of the things which I told, so please hit the follow button or subscribe to have similar content. And in this series of videos, I thought of making my basic understanding on psychology. So I started going through some podcast videos, and at the same time, I'm trying to take up an online course, a diploma on psychology. So I thought to just share my knowledge, which I'm learning. This is for someone who has no clue on psychology and wants to know and learn on stuff related to it. And also in my previous video, I've made why we should learn psychology and why is it important. And I think that's really important to understand as well. Whoever wants to dive in the concept of psychology or want to learn, dig deeper, it has different advantages, especially self-awareness and social awareness is, I would say, one of the top two and makes you think. So let's get started. So in this, I wanted to cover the very basic concept on conditioning, right? So, how our human brain and what are the different aspects it's connected to, and how there are different elements with association and stimulus and things like that. So once you understand, you can make a lot more meaning out of this video. So let's dive in on conditioning and learning. So this dates back, I think a lot of years back, where Pavlov actually demonstrated this experiment. And there are basically two types of conditioning. One is classical conditioning, and another one is the operant conditioning. And this video, I'll just stick to the classical conditioning, and maybe another video on operant conditioning. So here in the image, you see a dog, and basically how he demonstrates the experiment is basically through the amount of saliva. And whenever there's basically a bell which is going to ring, and then basically a guy with the food comes in, keeps it, and then does it again another time, and then another time, and repeats this cycle until the dog actually learns the things and associates the bell, the sound of the bell, to the guy, to the food. So this is a very rough idea of the concept. So let's dive a little deeper on understanding some few key terms so that it'll be useful for the upcoming videos as well. So the idea is to make also a playlist of videos, and I think it'll be really nice if we have a very basic foundation and a common understanding as well. So first is neutral stimulus. And what does that mean? Is basically it's a stimulus, for example, a bell or a guy walking in. Basically, prior to that, it doesn't invoke any response. For example, when the bell is rung for the first time, right, the amount of saliva the dog produced was basically not at all related to it, right? So that's a neutral stimulus. So the dog didn't have any idea what the bell means, dog didn't learn anything. So basically, this always becomes the conditioned stimulus, right? The bell again, coming to the same example because it's nice to have one example and then follow through with the all key elements, right? So that's called a neutral stimulus start, and then it slowly becomes a conditioned stimulus. And there are also other terms, of course. There is this unconditional stimulus and unconditional response. And I think it's self-explanatory, but the idea is a stimulus before its condition is unconditional stimulus, and the amount of saliva, which is response, right, of the dog. In the Pavlov's experiment we saw in the first picture, that's unconditional response. It doesn't have any idea what the bell means, period. But what happens after few times? It can be at fixed interval, it can be after, a fixed frequency. There are different ways to stimulate. At a certain point, the dog creates association. Okay, once the bell rang, it starts making more saliva. It's getting more hungry. It's kind of knowing that once the bell is rung, I'm going to get food. And that part is association, right? Very straightforward. You do A, you get an output B. It's a very simple, direct correlation. And then the bell becomes the conditional stimulus, right? And the condition is basically, it knows the association. Once it's associated, then the stimulus, which was unconditioned, become conditioned. Straightforward. And the response, which is the amount of saliva the dog secretes, becomes the conditioned response, right? Very straightforward, simple terms. And this is something which we would have probably encountered in our daily lives as well, right? For example, as soon as we hit the bed, our brain is conditioned to sleep. So few people have a really high association with bed and sleep. But at the same time, if we start associating bed with doing some other activity, our brain thinks, when you hit the bed, you're supposed to watch your phone, watch a video, or watch an episode on Netflix. And that's when the sleep gets a little disturbed. So one of the reasons where people have little disturbed sleep is because of your brain associating bed to something else apart from sleep. And so these kind of simple things, once you know the nuances, and we also associate a lot of things in life, right? For example, once alarm rings, we kind of imagine we automatically hit our restroom or, brush our teeth, go to a bath. It's a very strong association that is supposed to do it, and it can get more complex as well. So a little more depth and conditional differences, especially with classical conditioning. There are also different things associated with it. It's kind of a cycle where there are a few terms where you need to understand is the extinction, right? So when a conditioned response is no longer reinforced, right? Because at some point, imagine you ring a bell and you do not give it any food, right? What will happen? The dog will be like, the bell doesn't work anymore. So that's the part of extinction. So you ring the bell, you put the stimulus, but do not give it food. Even though if it responds with the saliva secretion, you don't give it food at the same time or after a period of time, it's going to stop. So that's a part of extinction, right? So if you want to break a habit, for example, if you want to stop doing something, you make sure you don't either respond to it, or once you respond, do not give the reinforcement which we expect. And again, I don't want to go a little deeper. So how to make or break an habit can be related to association, and it can be a really strong tool to, grow and improve our lives as well. Next important term is the stimulus generalization. So when an organism is conditioned to a response, and it often responds to a similar stimulus, right? I mean, it gets so obvious that every time a bell rings, it's going to secrete saliva, you're going to get food. It was a very, very straightforward association, and it keeps happening again and again and again, right? And the very important thing here, Pavlov also makes sure that the pitch of the bell is really important. Same every time. Even slight differences might alter the association for the dog, right? So it's the same stimulus, same response, and you generalize it. Next is stimulus discrimination. So an organism responds to a condition, but detects a difference in the stimulus, right? So very simple example. Again, I'm taking Pavlov's dog experiment. It did not respond when the bell-like stimulus. It was quite different, right? When the pitch is different, frequency, or let's say a different type of bell, for example, it's totally different. Dog is like, there's something odd. It's not the same stimulus. So I'm in doubt whether I'm going to get food or not. So I'm not going to secrete any saliva. So this is kind of you're distracting it, or let's say stimulus is being discriminated, right? There is no uniformity. There is no common grounds. The frequency or pitch of the bell, for example, in Pavlov's experiment is changing. So that's when the stimulus is discriminated. And finally, spontaneous recovery. So at some point, there's a reappearance of this conditioned response after extinction. Let's say for some time, dog doesn't respond due to some reasons, due to other external environmental changes, or it's smelling something weird or something. But once it starts responding again, that's when the stimulus is being regenerated, or let's say the response is being regenerated for the same stimulus, and it's recovered. So that's spontaneous recovery of the stimulus response condition. So I think it's getting too technical step by step. So just to wrap up, we saw the, a very classical example of classical conditioning, where a dog secretes saliva based on the bell sound and every time a food is generated. And we learned about stimulus, and especially unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response prior to the association. Once the association happens, we have conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, a very straightforward one. And these are kind of elements, cyclic elements of classical conditioning, where based on the stimulus and response, whether it's happening, whether it's generalized, whether it's being discriminated with a different stimulus, or it's last extinct and then it's recovered. So I think with this, I'm going to stop this video on classical conditioning. So there's a very important start, and then we'll be moving on to operant conditioning. And I think there are much more cooler elements coming, where we learn about the parts of the brain, what are the different functions of the brain, and especially, the next module goes into perception and illusion and things like that. So stay tuned. I'll try to keep it as simple at the same time as descriptive as possible. So the idea is to learn at the same time, not become an expert or do a PhD in this topic. So I hope you guys liked it. At the same time, keep learning, keep exploring, and always end with some chord. We become what we repeatedly do. So I really look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Until then, have a great day ahead, or a wonderful sleep. See you guys.